There's a moment every democracy reaches when the institutions still stand, the elections still happen, but the spirit that animates them begins to flicker. Thom Hartmann has spent a lifetime tracing that erosion, from the moral compromises of the Reagan years to the full-blown oligarchy of today. His new book, The Last American President, A Broken Man, a Corrupt Party, and a World on the Brink, isn't just about Donald Trump. It's about the machinery that made him inevitable, the billionaires, the propaganda networks, the party structures, and the civic exhaustion that allowed authoritarianism to dress up as populism. Hartmann argues that democracy in America didn't collapse overnight. It was privatized, hollowed out, and sold back to us as entertainment. But he also insists it can be rebuilt if we are willing to name what broke it. Thom Hartmann joins us now, broadcaster, author of more than 40 books, and one of the most enduring voices in American political media, to talk about how we got here and whether the title of his new book is Prophecy or Warning. Welcome, Thom.
Hey, Oliver, or Taylor, excuse me.
It's okay. No worries. I've been called Tracy. So with a name with Taylor Darcy, people will conflate the name and I end up being Tracy. So there are worse things to have been called in life, in my opinion. So thank you so much for being here. I sincerely appreciate your time. I wanted to start with not Trump himself, but the word last. When you call him the last American president, are you warning that the office itself, the democratic idea of accountable power, may not survive what comes next? Or is last your metaphor for the end of a certain kind of America we thought we knew?
Well, kind of both. Donald Trump is talking about running again in 2028. He's passing out Trump 2028 hats to anybody who comes to the White House.
Right.
He could pull a Putin. Putin, the Russian Constitution limited the president to 2 terms. And so for his 3rd term, he had his vice president, Dmitry Medvedev, run for president, and Putin ran as vice president. Trump could certainly do that. He'll be 83 in 2028. So I think all of that's kind of unlikely. Arguably what the title references is, as you said, the presidency itself being so distorted by the Trump time in the White House that we wouldn't recognize it as a normal American presidency as it goes forward.
Right. I think, the value of acknowledging it. I've talked about this to people and I said, the founding fathers never envisioned that we would have quite the malignancy that existed. To one degree or another, they had some honor and they never thought that we would have 3 branches of government that would all succumb to the dishonor that the current regime, provides. And so they didn't build this type of safeguards into the Constitution that would have anticipated that. They anticipated checks and balances, rightfully so. But what they didn't anticipate was when the checks and the balances were, everybody agreed on not following those checks and balances, right? And I think that we have to face that and go, okay, is this the end or is this a stress test, right? What can we put in place going forward to help reduce the likeliness that if we're able to get out of this, that it'll happen again, right? Like, what can we do to prevent it from happening? What constitutional amendments, just like we did during Reconstruction, that we can put into place that will allow us to prevent a Donald Trump from hurting the country after this? I'm not suggesting I have any of those answers. I'm simply saying we need to acknowledge that that's where we are. You traced Trump's psychology back to his father, Fred Trump, and to Roy Cohen's mentorship. 2 of the men were definitely defined by their cruelty and control. How did these formative relationships shape his view of power?
Well, his father, according to his niece, who's a licensed clinical psychologist, was a psychopath. Psychopaths are people who do not experience the emotions of other people. They basically think of themselves as the only real human being in the entire world, the only person who's genuinely capable of experiencing, emotion, particularly emotions like love. And so they view other people as objects to be moved around in the grand game of their lives. And his father was also brutal toward Donald. So and his mother, who was a Scottish immigrant, the Trump men seem to like to marry immigrant women. His mother, during the summers when he would come home from the military academy that his father had sent him to because he was unmanageable in school, his mother would leave the country. She'd go back to Scotland for the summer all alone. And so basically he grew up without a mother and with a father who was, a brutal psychopath who drove his older brother to basically commit suicide with alcohol in his 40s. And so I think he ended up just a very, very badly damaged person, with this giant empty spot in his soul and his heart. And that's why he's constantly seeking affirmation and approval and love. It's why he has a cabinet meeting and he goes around the room and everybody has to tell him how wonderful he is. And he has a meeting with a bunch of billionaires, and business leaders, and they go around the room and everybody has to tell him how wonderful he is. And when he sits down with world leaders, he calls up Putin, and Putin tells him how wonderful he is over and over and over again. Putin's an old KGB officer, intelligence officer. He knows how to manipulate people. And then he meets with Zelensky, and Zelensky wants to talk business, and he's like, "Oh, you didn't tell me how wonderful I am. Screw you."
Right.
So, we've got this very weird dynamic of this very damaged person in the White House who is not acting with the primary question being what's in the best interest of the nation or what's in the best interest of the people of the nation or the long-term interests of the nation, but rather what's in it for me and how can I get more love and adoration and money. Money has kind of filled the space throughout his life that normal people have with, affection and love and family and trust and friendship. And for Trump, he's not capable of those things. His whatever humanity was in him when he was born, it was beaten out of him by his father. And then, Roy Cohn, who was another psychopath, who taught him how to be a high functioning psychopath, how to function in society. And there's a lot of those out there, by the way. Good psychological studies find that psychopaths appear among CEOs at about 3 times the rate of the normal population. It's possible to be a high-functioning psychopath. In fact, actually, most high-functioning psychopaths are very, very charming. They're able to get other people to do things because they've figured out that these chess pieces that you manipulate, these other human beings, here's how you get what you want out of them. Right. And so that he's running our country based on that, and it's just doing incredible damage to our nation.
Yeah, I mean, government was never meant to be run by a business person, right? Business being for profit.
Well, they're different things.
Yeah, they very much are. I teach business law at a community college down close to me, and one of the things that I talk about is that the shareholder primacy rule, right? That the profits above all, and while that has value in capitalism, it doesn't have the same value in government where there should be considerations made for people, right? There should be, money should not be the main thing that's driving. And I talk about it in the context that everything comes back to money. Government makes decisions based on money, and I'm not saying it shouldn't be a factor, but it shouldn't be the sum whole of all factors that go with decision making in government. Versus in business, that is the sole factor. Businesses live and die by that, and so you have to make something profitable, understandably, to guide and to produce well thought out, products. But when you have companies like Ford that make decisions based upon profit, where they would rather the Pinto kill hundreds of thousands of people rather than do the right thing and replace the Pinto part for $11, that's a bigger issue, right? That's a bigger problem because now we're choosing money over life. And I always bring it back to, capitalism is fine as long as it's not toxic. Toxic being hurting others for the pursuit of profits. So do you see that authoritarianism in America more performative than ideological when it comes to Trump?
Well, first of all, let me respond to what you just said. I think that when the Michigan Supreme Court ruled in the case where Horace Dodge was suing Henry Ford back in the day, and ruled the shareholder primacy should be job one, essentially. There's never been a federal ruling to that effect, and everybody just cites the Michigan Supreme Court case. I think that was wrongly decided, frankly, and historically, companies have had multiple shareholders. A company has an obligation to its stockholders, of course, but it also has an obligation to its employees. It has an obligation to its customers, and it has an obligation to its community. And those should be given equal weight, in my opinion, under law. Now, that's not the way the law works right now, but it certainly was the way that Franklin Roosevelt was trying to bend the law in the 1930s, and to a large extent from the 30s until the 80s, the way that the law worked. So government, on the other hand, has a singular mandate, which is provide for the general welfare, domestic tranquility and all that, the stuff that's outlined in the Constitution, particularly in the preamble. And government uses money to accomplish those in some cases, uses power to do other things, but this whole idea that you need to run government like a business is just literally insane. I mean, it's just, businesses are designed to produce products or services and generate profit out of that. I mean, that's how you structure a business. And government is not designed to produce products or services. It's designed to serve the people. And the debate, I think, with regard to government really needs to be, where does the commons begin and end? In the United States, we've decided, and the commons. The commons is the stuff we all collectively own. It's through our government. That's why the early states were called commonwealths: the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, the Commonwealth of Virginia, and it's the Commonwealth. It's the shared wealth of all the people. And so, this is the stuff that conservatives derisively refer to as socialism. So what we have a broad societal consensus about is that it's appropriate to have socialism with regard to our army, our military, that the government runs that, even goes to the point of, feeding and housing and clothing people, the soldiers, and providing medical services at no cost. It's okay to have socialism with our police departments. It's okay to have socialism with our fire departments. It's okay to a large extent to have socialism, with our public roads and stop signs and things like that we enforce for public safety. It's okay to have socialism to a certain extent with our public school system. But it's not okay to have socialism with regard to our colleges. It's not okay to have socialism with regard to healthcare. We stand alone among all the developed nations in the world in that regard. The 34 OECD countries, the 34 richest countries in the world, out of those 34 countries, about 500,000 people every year go bankrupt because somebody in their family got sick. 100% of those bankruptcies are in the United States. Among those 34 countries, there's about $2 trillion, $1.7 trillion in debt as a result of people wanting to go to college. 100% of that debt, or virtually 100% of that debt, exists here in the United States. So these are the debates that we really should be having if we're going to have a conversation about, running government like a business and all that sort of thing. Now, to your question about authoritarianism, we have shifted over the last 44 years, really since the Reagan Revolution, into a form of government, from basically a constitutionally limited representative democratic republic into an oligarchy. Oligarchy is where the wealthy basically run both the economy and the government. And to a large extent, this was the result of a series of Supreme Court decisions. The Buckley decision in 1976, the Bellotti decision in 1978. These decisions ruled that money is speech and corporations are people. The Citizens United decision in 2010 that doubled down on that, McCutcheon in 2013 that tripled down on it. And the consequence of these decisions has been that, like in business, money has become a primary driver of individual behavior. The problem with oligarchy And I think you can make a strong case that really certainly since the Bush presidency, that virtually, but I would argue since the Reagan presidency, virtually every major decision that has been made at the behest of big money, of either the morbidly rich or giant corporations. If you look at the period from 1933 to 1981, government did an enormous amount of stuff. I mean, we got Social Security, we got Medicare, we got Medicaid, we got food stamps, we got subsidized housing, we got public schools, we got basically free college education, although that was actually Lincoln with the Morrill Act, back in 1865, I think it was, that, created the land grant colleges out of federal land. We got the WPA and the CCC and the EPA and the Food and Drug Administration, and all of these federal agencies that all were designed to benefit the public good and to enhance the welfare and stability and safety of the nation. Since Reagan, I've been running a contest on my radio show for 23 years. You can win the prize, which is an autographed book, if you can name one major piece of legislation that was proposed by Republicans, that was written by Republicans, that was passed by a Republican House and Senate and signed into law by a Republican president, whose principal beneficiary is the average working person. There literally isn't one.
No, there's
none since 1981. Prior to 1980, that's pretty much all government did. We got the Wagner Act, the right to unionize. We got the minimum wage laws. We got a 90% top tax bracket, 60% top corporate tax bracket. All of these things that benefited the average person. None of that has been happening since 1981. That's the classic characteristic of oligarchy. And the problem with oligarchy is that it's a transitional form of government. Oligarchy never lasts more than a couple of generations. We're 2 generations now into this oligarchy, and really 1 full generation into full-blown oligarchy. And particularly since Citizens United, it's been 15 years. And the problem with oligarchy is that eventually the people look around and go, we're being screwed by these rich people. We're not going to take this crap anymore. And they rise up. And then at that point, the oligarchs have 2 choices. They can go in one of 2 directions. They can either, as they did in 1933 when FDR confronted them, say, okay, cool, we give. We're going to just go back to making money and you run the government. And the wealthy people and big corporations basically stopped playing the game of politics from 1933 to 1981. Or they can say, no, we're not going to tolerate this uprising. We're going to crush it with an iron fist, which is what the oligarchs in the Old South did when the South in the late 1840s, early 1850s ceased to be a democracy. It went through an oligarchic period from the 1820s to the 1840s. And then that oligarchy turned into what today you would call a fascist state. And anybody who resisted the power of the 100 or couple hundred families, plantation families who owned the South, white people were lynched for rebelling against them. So it looks like Trump's inclination is to come down with the giant fist or the iron boot, to quote Grover Cleveland's second State of the Union address. And he says, as we look at these trusts and combinations of great capital, we see an iron heel upon the neck of the average working person. I mean, literally the only Democrat who was president in the post-Civil War 19th century in his 1887. It's really worth reading, State of the Union address. So here we are. Are we going to return to a small d democratic form of government in a Republican system, like we had prior to 1981, or are we going to flip this oligarchy into autocracy? Those are the 2 directions you can go. Hungary, went into oligarchy and then became autocracy. Russia went into oligarchy, then became autocracy. Turkey. The list goes on, right? And about a quarter of the time, that transition to autocracy happens in wealthy countries when they slide into oligarchy. About 3/4 of the time, it doesn't. The people push back and fight back, and so far that's been our history. We've been through 3 cycles like this.
Right.
One during the Revolutionary era, one during the Civil War era, and one during the Republican Great Depression era. And it's an open question right now. whether we're going to end up with a strongman form of government, run by Trump and his lick spittles, or whether the people are going to resist. And to a large extent, the fate and future of that's going to depend on whether the Republican Party continues to cower before Donald Trump. And I think that's why he pardoned George Santos the other day. George Santos had committed financial crimes. He was not convicted of all his lies. He was convicted of actually stealing money from people. He stole hundreds of thousands of dollars from people. And he was ordered to pay $350,000 back to people and also a $230,000 fine to the government. And now Trump says he doesn't have to pay any of that. This was Trump's way of saying to every Republican in office right now, if you stay with me, if you kiss my ass, if you do what I say, if you praise me to the ceiling and never stop, then nothing will stop me from making your life wonderful. I'll even bail you out of jail after you've been convicted of by a jury of your peers of major crimes, major felonies. On the other hand, look at Jim Comey, former FBI director and a lifelong Republican. Even if you're a lifelong Republican, if you defy me, I will destroy you. And that's the only thing that's holding together the Republican Party right now is fear and reward. It's a carrot and stick thing, but the reward is power and money. And the fear is the loss of both and Donald Trump's vengeance. So, I don't know where we're going to go with this, but that's the great paradigm. That's the kind of binary choice. I lay that out in the book.
Yeah. I think it's interesting, though, that had it not been for Comey, Trump probably wouldn't have gotten his first term.
Yeah, it's a great irony.
It is. It truly is. Because you look at it and you go, because Hillary, I believe, was well on her way to win that election. And then he released that final report 11 days before the election. And,
she dropped 3 points in the polls that day.
She did. I watched it and my words were, oh shit. For lack of a better way of saying it, that was what it was, because how do you come back from that? You don't. There's no way that unfortunately, what works for Trump does not work for anyone else, right? Like Trump would have risen 3 points in the polls if that would have been the reverse situation, right? But Hillary died 3 points in the polls that day for her. And it's really interesting, this double standard the media and a lot of people have. Trump, has said multiple times of all the things he gets away with. They don't call him Teflon Don for nothing. And it's really sad, because he's one of the most deplorable, despicable people you could possibly imagine, yet he's given more free reign and latitude than anyone I've ever heard of. And it's like, what happened to morals, values? I would never want my children to grow up thinking that Donald Trump was someone to aspire to. And yet we have that in the Republican Party and MAGA for the most part, thinking he's the best thing since sliced bread. And you just have to shake your head and go, but how? Right? Like the rest of us rational human beings.
I think he hates the same people they hate.
Yeah. And that's a valid point. That's a valid point. He hates the things that they hate, and he's all about the money, all about the power, and that's what they respect. They don't respect empathy, understanding, patience, any of the virtues that supposedly, this was what John Fugelsang and I talked about, anything that Christ actually taught, right? Like they call themselves Christian, but they don't act it. They don't show.
Not even close.
Not even the same ballpark of it. I guess part of this is that as we see that money rules in his world, with the crypto scams and everything that's going. I mean, he's the only president that's ever become richer by being president rather than poorer by being president.
Yeah, and Jimmy Carter almost went bankrupt being president.
And I mean, the rap that he got, by it's just such a fit of irony that the Democrat, lost, and yet here we have Trump that is doing worse and is winning, and it's you have to shake your head in disbelief and irony all at the same time. Wanted to move on and talk about, you've written that the United States has functioned as an oligarchy for generations, something we just talked about long before Trump. What do you say is new about this iteration of oligarch power?
It's that for the first time, the defiance of the law has become, a feature rather than a bug. Nixon defied the law and got busted and got his hands slapped and had the good grace to resign office. And several of his, I think about a dozen of his senior officials, including his attorney general and his attorney, John Mitchell and John Dean, went to prison. And Nixon could have gone to prison had Jerry Ford not pardoned him. Um, the crimes that Nixon committed are tiny compared to the crimes that Trump has committed just right out in front of all of us, even in his first term. And then, stealing all those classified documents when he left. And now you've got the Epstein questions about when he ran the Miss Teen USA, or he owned the Miss Teen USA pageant. Was he using that as a device to funnel, young girls to Jeffrey Epstein? Is that what that was all about? Is that why he's trying so desperately to cover up the Epstein files? I mean, nobody knows, right? Well, actually, probably Cash Patel and Pam Bondi know, but they're not telling. So we'll see where this goes. But I really think that that's the defining feature, and to an extent, to a large extent, actually, John Roberts and five other right wing, bought off, paid off, well bribed members of the United States Supreme Court have facilitated that by saying that Trump can commit any crime he wants. I mean, to quote Sonia Sotomayor, he could order SEAL Team 6 to murder Joe Biden, and they would do it, and they could do it, and he could not be held to account under any circumstances. He would never suffer any penalty for it. If he could do that, he can do pretty much anything. He can tear down the east wing of the White House. He can, which is illegal, by the way.
Yeah.
He can steal money. He can take a $2 billion bribe from the United Arab Emirates, where they gave that money to his two sons, and then give them hundreds of thousands of top secret chips that are never ever supposed to go to China, when the United Arab Emirates has a joint defense treaty with China, and they share technology. So, and those are just two of, literally hundreds of examples. He can violate the Hatch Act, and sell Teslas from the front of the White House. It's just insane. The law breaking, the naked criminality that Trump does. And then, anybody asks him about it, he just basically gives them the middle finger. If it's a reporter, he tells them they're terrible reporters, or he refuses to even let their news agency, ask him questions. So that I think is the defining characteristic of the Trump presidency, is not just lawlessness. We saw that in his first term, but lawlessness that he is proud of, essentially, and that his people who are charged with administering the law, largely, Kristi Noem, Pam Bondi, Cash Patel, are essentially co-conspirators with, or at the very least, turning their eyes away.
Right.
And you could argue that we saw some of that with John Mitchell around Nixon, but other than that, this is new in American history.
All right. Do you think there's any point at which Trump will be held accountable?
I don't. I suspect he will either die in office, or when he retires, if he retires. I don't expect him to. That he will figure out ways to, if nothing else, to pardon himself. I don't. He's made a career of not being accountable for anything. He's done this his entire life, basically. He's always thought of himself as above the law. See, this is the thing about psychopaths. They don't think that they're normal humans. They think that they're superhumans.
Right.
They believe that their lack of empathy is their superpower. And to a large extent, that's true.
Right. I know I was hoping that the Epstein files would put a bigger dent in MAGA than what it had, because for the most part, they were coming out against it as when they thought that only Democrats were in the files, and then with Trump being who he is, and him. It's kind of obvious at this point he's there somehow, some way, that they would, that now they're like, oh, no big deal, right? Like, and you have to evaluate that and go, So why was it important before if it's not important now? And why are you so willing to sell your, any modicum of integrity whatsoever for the sake of, I mean, I thought that was something that as a civilization, right? Like, I don't just mean, politically, I mean, as a civilization, we could come to agreement on that is bad. And yet we have a complete party that is like, nope, that's cool. We don't mind at all.
Yep.
That we have pedophiles in our government and in positions of power. And yet that was what they were very much campaigning against. That I thought was our bottom. I thought that was our, okay, once we hit there, MAGA's going to break and the fever's going to break. And eventually, and it just keeps on being, there's no bottom. And it's rather sad because I thought people had more integrity and were better than that. We're more decent, that we could agree on that as a human race. That and cannibalism, you would think, would be areas, but I don't know. Maybe that's next. Maybe they're accepting that someday. What do you think of Project 2025? And it was written. They literally were bold enough to come out and say it, and people were talking about it for anybody that was paying attention knew about Project 2025, and yet people still were apologists and saying, probably not, right? Like, and you're like, okay, except for the only thing that Trump is consistent with is lying. That's his one thing he's consistent.
Yeah, he claimed he didn't even know what it was.
Right, and
now he's bragging about it.
And exactly, and that's the other part is that anything that's malignant he embraces with absolute impunity. So if you have a liar that embraces malignancy with impunity, Project 2025 is like your dream come true for that type of thing. How do we deal with that? How do we move forward? How do we push beyond accepting that as a foregone conclusion that it's going to happen, right? Because we're at 50%, I guess. People have been talking about we're a little more than 50% of the way through all of Project 2025. And we're, 10 months in? What are your thoughts on that?
In 1954, when the Brown versus Board decision came down, the Fred Koch, the oil baron who had made his fortune drilling offshore wells for Stalin, and the father of Charles and David and other Koch brothers, Koch family members, began funding the John Birch Society with putting up billboards all across America that said "Impeach Earl Warren." And that was arguably the beginning of this project to roll back the New Deal.
Right.
The consensus, the thinking of these people was that the New Deal was socialism, that it was going to drive America toward communism, that we really shouldn't have unemployment insurance. That's a form of communism. That we shouldn't have the minimum wage. It's a form of communism. Unions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so 54, I think, was the starting point. Although in 51, Russell Kirk wrote his book, The Conservative Mind, arguing that this needed to happen, that we needed to roll back the New Deal. And that's still considered the Bible of the modern conservative movement. Then it picked up speed in 71 when Lewis Powell wrote his famous memo to his next door neighbor and best friend and the president of the United States Chamber of Commerce, Eugene Sindor, saying that basically, big business and wealthy individuals have been on the sidelines since FDR slapped him down in 33, and it's time to get back in the game. And we need to take over the courts. We need to take over the universities. We need to take over the media and create our own media. We need to take over Congress, of course, politically everywhere. We need to control public opinion. We need to build think tanks. We need to have our own universities, et cetera. And then the next year, Richard Nixon put him on the Supreme Court. And then in 78, he actually Lewis Powell authored the First National Bank versus Bellotti decision, which was the one where they said not only is money speech for the purposes of the First Amendment, but that corporations are persons. And that had been said before in 1886 in Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad. I wrote a book about it called Unequal Protection, but that echoed through our history, but it had never been as emphatically stated and carved into law as it was with the Bellotti decision. And that was when the real project began. That out of that, in the late 70s and early 80s, came the Heritage Foundation, the Cato Institute, which was formerly the Charles Koch Foundation, the American Legislative Exchange Council. Every single state now has a state policy center, a giant think tank that produces local propaganda, all funded by this network that arguably began with Fred Koch back in the 50s. And this project has been a project to roll back basically the 20th century, to roll back the New Deal that started in 1933 and take us back to a time when unions not only had no power, but weren't even technically legal any longer. We're more than halfway there. We've gone from, a third of us being unionized in 81 when Reagan came into office to around 7% today. To freeze the minimum wage, it's still at $7.25 an hour in most former Confederate states, which is, not even close to a living wage. It was actually a living wage when FDR passed it back in 34 or 35. To destroy Medicare, to privatize Medicare. That's the whole Medicare Advantage scam, as an effort to privatize Medicare. To privatize Social Security. That's up next on their agenda. To basically take all of these programs and undo them and turn them over to the so-called free market, which really means just put them under oligarchy control. And I think it's important to note that the Roaring '20s was a period of peak oligarchy in the United States. F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote about it in Great Gatsby, which is most people's understanding of that era.
Right.
And that's the world that they want to return us to. When women had no rights, and they're fairly explicit about this. You'll recall, Charlie Kirk, talking about how women should just basically shut up and, just do their job in the kitchen and the bedroom. When racial minorities were secondary or tertiary in the caste system of the United States. When great wealth was independent of authority, essentially, when it could rise above the law and defy the law. And Project 2025 is kind of the complete how-to manual to roll back the New Deal.
Right.
And, that's what they're doing. And when you understand it in that context, it all makes sense.
Yeah. So, and that's an important thing to note, is that this has been going on for years. This isn't just a, yes, it was Project 2025, but they've been working on it since, you said like 1971, I remember correctly?
Yeah, 71 was the Powell Memo, which was arguably the foundation of Project 2025.
Right. So, in other words, and part of what I want people to understand is that the decisions that we make today have to influence what's going to happen tomorrow, right? That we can't just show up to the party late and expect to be able to overcome these issues that have been being implemented, right? We can't codify things that need to be codified in an instant. We need to get people into place that will make those decisions, or that will help make those decisions, in order to do that. And that starts today, right? Like, that doesn't start in 2026. I think there's a unfortunate educational deficit in the country where, I just show up to the polls and I elect the person that I want, right? And rather than thinking through it and going, okay, well, no, I need to make sure that the people that are in positions in school boards, in local elections, are in positions to make good choices that we want to be made too now, so that in 7 years from now, 8 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, they're in positions to make choices that will help us move forward as a society as well. Codifying Roe, universal health care, all of these different types of things that the New Deal started, but we need to keep going and keep pushing and making those happen for real. Because otherwise, if you just take it election by election, we're always going to get whooped, right? Like, we're going to get trounced by the people that are planning and that are going to, show up and do this stuff. Now, that being said, certainly I think the No Kings rally that just happened was certainly beneficial to our country, in that, the MAGA was kind of losing their minds over it and saying some really stupid things. And then they came back and said, well, it's just a bunch of old people, old hippies and stuff. So you go from once calling us some Hamas terrorists to it's a bunch of old white people, and you look terribly inconsistent to anybody who's not MAGA. And I think that that's a valid, that we're moving in a at least an oppositional right direction, right? Like I think that, people that are comparing us to, 1930s Germany aren't looking at, in the American ethos, we've always been a bit of the rebel, the defiant child, if you will, to one degree or another. We've had the lone cowboy, that would save the girl and ride off into the sunset. And for better or for worse, and I'm not suggesting that's accurate, I'm simply saying it's an acknowledgement that we've never really wanted to submit to authority since the foundations of the nation. And that was where we've come from. And I think that when we push it and say, okay, it's not the same thing as Germany, because we've never been in the submission category. We've always pushed back on things, and we've always kind of been the rogue, to one degree or another. I mean, we're the only country in the entire world that's dropped a nuclear weapon on another country. And if that doesn't say anything about us, I don't know what does. You know what I mean? Thom, your book is excellent. I started reading it. I wasn't able to finish it. But are there any last minute thoughts that you have that you'd like to share about where we're at and where you hoped that we could be headed?
There was an old saying, if everyone lit one little candle, what a bright world this would be. I think that each one of us has the ability to awaken at least one other person in our lives, whether it's a coworker, a family member, a friend, somebody you meet at the grocery store in line. And that's the work that we have to be doing. We have to be sharing this message of what's actually going on if we're going to see change happen in this country. So, tag, you're it.
Yeah, I think that's so important. That's actually one of the reasons why I started the podcast, was because I felt like that my best use of my abilities is in these types of interviews and situations, right? Bringing my voice to that, letting people know that there's someone standing up for them, that, that I'm not okay with the way that the immigrants are being treated. I'm not okay with the way that the trans and the LGBTQ population is being treated. I have an uncle who is gay, and this idea that he is somehow less of a citizen because of who's in office is not okay by me. And so I want to be that ally for these people, because I'm in a position, using my white privilege, if you will, I'm in a position to help and to voice and let them know that they're not alone, that they're not, that they have a friend, they have someone who's willing to stand up and say, this isn't okay. And even if I'm able to, let one person know that there's hope, that not all, forgive me for saying, not all white people are evil, or that we all want to see them put in internment camps and concentration camps, that's not who we are, and they're still good, and so hopefully helping them get through the tough times that they're having to endure, that while I didn't cause, that they still have to live through. So thank you so much, Thom, for your time. I sincerely appreciate it. Where can people find you if they'd like to reach out to you?
My daily writings are at hartmannreport.com, and the information about our radio and television program is over at thom.tv, thom.tv. And Hartmann Report has two N's on Hartmann. So those are the best places to find my stuff.
Nice.
And thank you, by the way, Taylor, for having me on your podcast. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here with you.
You're very welcome. I appreciate you coming. Thank you.